Welcome back to the True Images podcast. I'm here with Ivan and Margot.
Hello.
I'm John Wolf.
Hello.
And still no Jason today, but Jason, when you listen, we miss you. Pop in soon with a video, hopefully. We'll see you. But it's been, I was just saying, I feel like a little, when you just have a day when you're just like, I feel off. Nothing's wrong, but I just feel like it's not in my groove. But my thing usually is that I listen to AC/DC Thunderstruck and I get the right mindset, but I don't know if it kicked in.
Your hype music?
That's my hype music, but I don't know if it kicked in today. Oh, man. But how have both of your weeks been so far? We're at the beginning, so it shouldn't be hopefully too bad.
It's been good. This weekend we had soccer tournaments, so I'm a sports dad right now. We had a game on Friday down in Mesquite for my son. And then afterwards, my daughter and I drove really fast back because we had a Lorcana tournament,
Nice.
a sealed draft tournament that we went to. And then the next day we drove in the morning to Mesquite, and we had to drive back for my daughter's volleyball game. So it was a lot of driving. And Sunday was a good, restful day, Sabbath as it were. And it was good. It was a good weekend. My son got second place, made it to the championship, which is cool. And my daughter did well with her volleyball. And I did very bad in the tournament this week, for Lorcana. I think my daughter and I got like second and first place, but on the opposite end. We got last and second last. But it was fun.
Is that I'm so out of this world. Is that like is it like a card thing? Like
Yeah.
you have like
So it's like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, you build a deck. I mean, I can't believe I'm talking about this right now. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm just letting myself get out there. But you build a deck and then you like battle against each other. So
very nice.
yeah, it's my daughter and my son plays and I play. It's fun. It's Disney. It's a Disney IP. So that's what got me into it.
There you go.
And it's not necessarily like, I haven't played it, but from what I understand, it's not necessarily about fighting other people. And, in the case of Magic, you're trying to kill kill your opponent.
It's like you got to get 20 life drained, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in Lorcana, it's less violent.
Yeah, it's they call it banishing, and and you're trying to gain lore. Man, this got really crazy. But that was my weekend. I see you got sports on one side, and then you have like really nerdy card games, and you could be both.
Good balance.
It's all right.
And John, I heard you talk with Mason about you were 3D printing something.
Yeah. So this weekend was very relaxing. So a contrast of dads were driving over the place. We stayed home, did a bunch of 3D printing. My youngest son is into basically aliens, if you're familiar with Warhammer 40K, the Tyranids, and so he's been scouring the internet for various models to print, and so we spent a lot of time doing that and building terrain, using both our FDM and resin printer, and so that was fun. Had a good time.
That's really cool.
Yeah, good time was had by all, and very relaxing. Spent the evenings watching Babylon 5, and if you don't know what that is, that's a sci-fi show from the 90s that is absolutely amazing. The individual decided who created it, tried to create a 5-year story or a 5-season story. And for the most part, save the last season, it was very fun. So we've been watching a lot of Babylon 5 and just chilling out, maxing, relaxing, all cool. We're not shooting some b-ball outside the school. But
Man, I'm podcasting with a bunch of nerds here.
I feel so safe right now. I'm sorry. Another thing I did do, I was holding this back, but they just released a Star Wars like anime, the 3rd season. And it's different anime studios that make a different story in the Star Wars universe. It's called Visions. Yep. I feel like I'm like shilling for Disney right now, but we are not sponsored by Disney.
They should pay
I'm
you
not.
for
I know.
this.
Once they get to it, their algorithm will flag it.
Find you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, mine was way less of those things, but it was also.
What a nice way to say it.
It felt relaxing, but it's I really love to plan a party, so I planned a party for someone this weekend, and it wasn't relaxing like, oh, I'm just sitting and enjoying the sunshine, but it was like a good, when you're doing something you love and you get a little refresh. And we went, another one of my other favorite things is we went to a new chicken wing restaurant, and I'm from upstate New York, and the guy was from upstate New York, so he knew how to do buffalo wings, right?
Where here?
In Cedar City.
Oh.
I know, a weird place to have like a brand new wing restaurant from a guy who lived in New York, but
I literally just watched a video like an hour ago about the best wings in America, and I'm getting really hungry right now.
So good. I love a buffalo wing. So party planning and buffalo wings make a well-rounded time.
Wow, that sounds.
So
really
we all had a
weekend.
really great time. It sounds like, which I love. And yeah, that hopefully I can get back on my game this week.
Yeah.
Hopefully you can. I feel like you just have to, like when you're down. At least when I am, I just have to like do a bunch of things that I enjoy and. I don't know. Usually for me, it's hiking. It's a lot of hiking. I almost have to, like, get angry about it. You know what I mean? Like, I need to get back in the game. And then I can kind of get myself there. But do you guys do anything when you're, like, when you have a rough day, when you're sad, that brings you back?
So there's an individual who used to be on the Food Network by the name of Alton Brown.
I love Alton Brown.
And Alton Brown, a few years ago, now it's probably been about 10 years ago, was going through some pretty challenging life events. And he tweeted that whenever he's feeling particularly low, he always makes biscuits, but he makes biscuits from the back of Swan Flour's biscuit recipe. So it's not fancy, it's not heavy duty. And so the idea of following routine, of doing something that's familiar to you, that is productive. So everybody likes biscuits. Even biscuits that don't quite turn out are still good biscuits. And the worst case, you can dredge them in gravy and they're okay. But, you find routine, you find the thing that you can fall into as long as there is something productive and good that comes from it. And so, in my case, it's, it may be teaching a class that I'm familiar with. It might be answering emails, but it's a matter of forcing yourself. Like part of the problem with having bad moments is just this sort of shutdown that happens, right? So that little voice, you were mentioning it earlier, whether you realized it or not, this sort of, I can't do this, the self-deprecating sort of thing, and just forcing yourself into the ritual routine event. And if I was being really snarky about it, I might say that that's a important reason as to why many within the Christian tradition actually have routine tied to their religious practices, because it provides us something to, when we can't fully be ourselves, we can fall back into the routine that can then help us, like your thunderstruck, it can help us get the traction that we need to begin to be aware of the place that we're in.
That's a way, way better answer than anything I ever would have said. Yeah, it is really routine. Like I have to make myself like fully get dressed or do the things that I really like to cook. And sometimes when you feel out of it, you're just like, we'll just have a frozen pizza. But then it really does make you feel better. Or I don't know if you guys, I really love hiking and certain exercises. And so it's like if I'm able to get in, once I do it, I'm like, oh, that was really good. But to get yourself there, you just have to like push yourself up that mountain sometimes.
I like playing games when I think that's something that we do, like even as our family, like we'll play games together, and that really
board
helps.
Games.
Yeah, board games. Walk around the block. A lot of those consistent family things. It's been really good lately. Like coming back home and being with the family and with the kids has really actually helped a lot. With a lot of the stressors, but that's good.
Sunshine and fresh air, people. You'll do it. Well, we have a great interview this week with Elly Arrow, and she was so nice to do this interview. She lives halfway around the world and made time to talk with us and chat with us. And she, I think, is another guest where I would say we probably don't have a lot of overlap. We're not from the same place. We look at the world differently, but have so much in common when it comes to this interview. And I learned a lot from Elly. I've learned a lot from her over the last few years, and I was really delighted that I got to actually speak with her. And another connection from her and Gail Dines, which Gail keeps coming up. I feel like if we had True Images podcast superlatives, Gail would just be like queen of justice or something. I don't know. But so it's a really great interview. So we'll dive in and be back to talk about it. Hi, Elly. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to meet you and chat with you today. And if you want to start by just giving us a little background to who you are and where you're at and the kind of things you're doing.
So my name is Elly Arrow. So arrow like bow and arrow. You can find me online under that name, Elly with a Y. And I'm from Germany, and I still live in Germany. I've lived here most of my life, and I've been an advocate for the last almost 10 years now, in the realm of violence against women and girls, but with a focus on commercial sexual exploitation of adults and minors, because these are not really two neatly separate industries once you take a closer look. And infamously, my country, Germany, has a legalized prostitution policy. So we have legal brothels, legal escort agencies, and for a time, our international reputation on that was fairly positive. Like, this is progressive, this is the future, this is a career choice for a number of women. And when you permit it, you can go in, remove the criminal elements, rescue, get the kids out, and then it'll be a glamorous job, but dignified enough for a society to work with. But in recent years, I think that reputation has diminished, and you hear more about how there's still a lot of criminal elements, a lot of crimes against women, a lot of human trafficking. It used to be like Romanian, Bulgarian women. Now it's a lot of women from Ukraine. And I think once you have war refugees ending up in our legal brothels, the happy sex work story doesn't really work so well anymore. Anyway, I spent the last 10 years looking into this after my own experience of German high school, where just this will be a universal experience, I think, at this stage in the digitalized world. Just the proliferation of hardcore pornography among really young children. I'm just on the cusp of the generation who grew up with that. And no adult really intervening or giving us any context. What is this material we're seeing? Who is producing it? What's that doing? What's that doing to our expectations of intimacy, of body image, all of that stuff? Feeling really adrift. And then I found the work of Gail Dines, who I would just recommend to anyone who has ever felt off about porn and wants to know why. She breaks it down perfectly. There's lots of free talks online. And I found her work and then realized that this porn industry connects directly to these legal brothels and escort agencies in my country, that a lot of the same people exploited in one form of the industry are exploited in the other, and how they recruit women, a lot of deception, criminality, exploiting vulnerabilities, it's the same. So I've kind of looked at that, and it's through the porn issue, it's something that's not just happening somewhere out there, but it's coming into everyone's homes pretty much. So that it's like both a big societal thing and a very personal thing. So I think like any young woman these days is like, can I tolerate my partner watching porn? Or if he's watched a lot in the past, what is he going to expect? Those kinds of, you start there and then you get into, like, it gets deeper and darker the more you go. And I've got into learning all I can about it, and then just ringing the alarm bells as loudly as I can in German and in English, because I'm bilingual, to let everyone know that we got a crisis here and we need to do something.
Absolutely. And that's fantastic that Gail Dines was the one who introduced you to a lot of these ideas. She was so kind to do an interview with us, and she's fantastic. Just speaking with her, she's just a fantastic, amazing human being. And I was wondering, so when you were growing up in a country where prostitution is legalized, did you have this idea for a while that this is a really positive thing? And it really seemed like beneficial in all of the, kind of stories that people tell about it that you were discussing earlier. Did you have that? And then one day you just kind of realized, or, got into some, access to more information and heard some people discussing it more and that kind of flipped the script? Or was there a moment maybe or experience that led to that new information?
So I used to think, which I think is the position a lot of people are at, or at least a lot of women are at, where they feel like I wouldn't want to do this. And the thought of like sitting in some room f 5 days a week or more and then having half a dozen strangers or more come by each day and uh, make sexual demands of me and being dependent on that to pay my rent, that I think most women have their intuition says no. No, I I couldn't stand that. But I did, like many people used to have the idea, oh, but I can't generalize my own feelings there to other women, and maybe there are women of a different temperament. It's hard to say that in a politically correct way because you end up very quickly constructing. So what is the woman who is fit for this? Um, how different is she from me? Well, she must have like a high, a high threshold for disgust, because men of like all shapes and sizes and sexual proclivities will come by. High pain tolerance because some of these acts are going to be painful. Um, and then you very quickly start actually dehumanizing women in the industry as fundamentally different from yourself, and describing a person that I don't think exists. I don't think anybody is born and their body can take things that other people would, fall at least, that would traumatize other people physically or mentally at a really really high risk. I I don't think that way anymore. And like I said, it took finding Gail Dines. Oh, you're frozen again. I don't know if you can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're good on your end.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Um, it- so from the work of Gail Dines, I also quickly went to, okay, a lot of these women are also in the prostitution industry. What does that industry look like in my country? And there's an increasing number of survivors who speak out, and they do call themselves survivors because near-death experiences in this industry are not rare. That can be drug overdose, because most women have to take substances to manage it physically and emotionally. That can be homicide. Like we do know that women in the industry are, I mean, they're meeting strangers often in unknown locations. Um, that is inherently dangerous. Like no matter what the laws are or regulations, or maybe she told somebody where she was gonna go, still very dangerous. Especially if that's a strange man or multiple who expect a sex act to happen, or just the slow chipping away at the soul of being seen as an object, as a sex machine by stranger after stranger after stranger, that if there wasn't feelings of worthlessness prior, which there are for many women, it's not a stereotype. There is research there, and I've looked into a lot of the research. Um, it will be created by that experience. So there's a really high risk. So it was women speaking out about that and just giving us the un uncensored truth of what these men are really requesting, how they really act. It's not, lots of lonely guys who just want to have a cuddle. It's sex at the push of a button, and she's easily replaceable. And if she shows disgust or irritation or pain, it's frequently disregarded. There's signs of her being trafficked. There's so many trafficking victims who said the buyers knew and they didn't care, or they could see I barely spoke the language. Like that's a huge indicator. Like how many women are being empowered by being in a country where they can barely talk to anyone, don't understand taxes or social security or the justice system. Like how many of them are meeting the buyer on eye level? It's that broke it for me, but also I also spent a lot of time listening to women who say that for them it's labor or even a hobby. And I found that almost um, like breaks the illusion even more because they repeatedly describe the same things as the women who consider themselves survivors. They describe a man out of nowhere strangling them or wanting to, urinate or defecate on them, those kinds of requests, or saying, I want to play a daddy-daughter scenario. That happens to those women too, but they reframe it as a bad client or a bad day at work or, well, I guess I'm just not going to see him anymore, but that doesn't mean it didn't impact. Um, so I don't consider that group of women to be completely separate over there, having a different experience with different men. It's the same experiences, but processed differently. And I also don't blame women for processing it that way. I think it's a lot in the way that domestic violence victims will say, oh, but he loves me. Yes, he beat me, but then he bought me flowers. It's a lot of the same psychological dynamics. Um, and then lastly, I spend a huge amount of time on internet forums where the buyers, it's almost entirely men who pay to access strangers' bodies sexually, they talk to each other. You have them in the US, you've got them all over the world. They're called John forums or punter forums. And they discuss, okay, this Monday I went to see Anna. She was 23. She's from Latvia. Her German was fairly decent. The blowjob was like this. The quality of her teeth was like this. I saw that, there was a weird guy behind the wheel who brought her there. Not sure what that's about, but like the service was decent. I'm probably going to see her again. That would be a tame review of a woman. And there are hundreds of thousands, millions of these online, and I started collecting them and I put them on a website. I'm not the first person to do this. There's something called the Invisible Men Project that I would recommend people look up, where the men share what they're doing to the women, like very matter of fact, just describing what they're doing. Um, Not necessarily, though frequently quite dehumanizing language, and just, exchanging intel with the other guys. Um, it's like if you think like locker room talk is a problem, you've seen nothing yet. So this is like the worst version of where men can go when they don't believe in, I guess, living together with other humans as equals, as full human beings, as when women are objects. This is the worst place that it goes. And once I've seen like the survivors, also the women who consider it work, and the men who pay for it all, I could never go back and be fine with this industry and be silent about it. So I'm happy to share a link for the Invisible Men Project as well as my version of it, which is the guys from Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. So German language countries, but I made sure that everything I published, I translated it to English because I really want the people outside of the German speaking world to know about what's happening here in the legal industry that's so freaked by the media, which is, in my opinion, so complicit and romanticizing this industry and only wanting to hear the happy stories, and then putting the trafficking sad story somewhere over there, like there is no relation, like temporal or location, or it's just the men. Like a man could see the happy woman on a Monday and then see the trafficked woman on a Friday. And sometimes he knows, sometimes he doesn't, sometimes he doesn't care. What kind of industry is that? Even if we assume that a significant number of the women are fine, which I would question, but let's assume, how can you touch somebody, uh, be inside the body of another person, and you're not sure if they want to be there? Because that's every time a man uses the prostitution industry, he can't be sure. Just like when you watch porn, people really hate this because porn consumption is so widespread. I understand, and I understand we're told it's normal, but you can never be sure that what you're watching, that person is fine, or how old that person is, or why it started for them, or if they were even paid after, or how they're doing now. You have no idea. And if you can't know if somebody else actually wants you to be there, it's like people call me sex negative, but I would say I'm not saying everyone, that's my opinion. I don't think I'm not like you can't sleep with somebody before marriage, but I am pro careful, age-appropriate exploration where you watch out what does the other person want, how well do they know their body, can we get to know each other, at like the safest possible format so that women and girls don't experience sex as traumatizing. I've been going on for a long time, just going to end on this part, which I think everyone's heard about at this chance, that our youngest generation is having the least sex. So this like sex positivity, porn is cool, prostitution's cool, OnlyFans, rah, rah, rah. But this group is the most afraid of sex, it seems, in like several generations. So nobody can tell me we don't have a problem. We might disagree about the details of the problem, but we definitely have one. And if you ask a lot of young people, porn is a huge, huge deal there. Or not wanting to date a man who's subscribed to OnlyFans, which very quickly can spiral into prostitution because a lot of the women on OnlyFans can't make enough money just with a camera. They have to meet the fans, which then is just prostitution.
Yeah. Wow. Those are very excellent points that you've made. And I wonder your thoughts on this. So something that really fascinates me is to say, okay, based on so much research and thousands of testimonies of survivors of the industry, it doesn't seem like this picture that you're painting could at all be true. But let's just say in a fantasy world that this is true, that the women that are there, everybody wants to be there. Every single person consents at all times, and they have nothing, like there's no outside pressures or coercion or past childhood traumas or anything that's led them here. Take all of that out. I think to be responsible consumers, we also have to consider not just I guess in the sense if you're commercializing someone's body and you're thinking about them as a product, so to say, you have to think about how that product came to be and does everyone consent and all of that. But then how does it affect the consumer? And when we have so much data that tells us that it's increasing sexual violence and it's increasing isolation and depression and anxiety and all of these really, just refueling sexual violence, I don't know how you can say, well, it's ethical because everyone said yes.
I mean, there's so much to say there. We know how the like high frequency porn users are not happy. If this was like just a fun hobby, the guys who feel like they have to do it for hours on day often are going through to therapists saying, I need help. I can't function anymore. But even more moderate porn use negatively affects your relationships. It's, I think, like a quarter or a third of divorces now have porn come up as a reason that the wife is divorcing the husband. So it's it. I know we've culturally normalized it, so I do have some compassion for especially boys, young boys who slip into it at like 9 and 10 at this stage now. This is or the the iPad toddlers like. It can't even be younger. You don't make a conscious and informed choice to consume. Like we can't call it that reasonably. So I do have some compassion there. But what was I going to say? Like the evidence is overwhelming that it's harming relationships between men and women in general, and that it can give you a temporary sexual high and fulfillment. A lot of men who use brothels also describe this just like, we call them curb crawlers when it's the street level prostitution when they drive around with their cars. If you want adrenaline or a dopamine, I'm sure it can serve that purpose for a time. But then we know, like Gail Dine says, the tendency is, oh, you need more extreme stuff. And or let's find a woman that's even younger, or let's find a woman who is noticeably in the throes of addiction to make it like special and exciting and still give you that feeling of power. Like that's not a healthy existence for the men. And recently, I totally forgot to mention, but I would highly recommend if anyone wants to know more. I am also part of a podcast project called Red Light Expose, most of our team are survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and pornography. I myself am not, but like I said, I'm part of the generation who grew up and did not consent to seeing this material or having to interact with all the ripple effects of it repeatedly to this day. But we are about to publish an episode on the subject of so-called shadow women. That's what they've been called in some of the research literature, who are the wives of men who use prostitution, wives and girlfriends, because there are literally around the world millions of women who are currently being cheated on, and it's already traumatic to be cheated on when you think you're in a committed relationship. But then there's the addition that high frequency prostitution use does absolutely increase STI transmission. A lot of these men do not want to use protection, so they're both infecting, they're passing around stuff to women in the industry back and forth. The women want to use condoms. The men see they're desperate, so they offer extra money. They pull the condoms off. This is incredibly frequent. We just had a government report just reaffirm that a lot of the women, they in prostitution and our legal brothels refuse the buyer's condoms. If he says, "Oh, I got a box, let's use this," you're like, I'll provide it. They won't use it. They don't trust it because there are too many men. I'm sorry that I know this is disturbing, but they have a fetish for violating consent in all kinds of ways, including manipulating that condom, harming the integrity of the condom. And so they are serially infecting their wives. There are a lot of wives. I was just recently listening to a woman who went through this, who never got tested for STIs because she was, I am in a committed relationship. I am staying true to my partner, so there's no reason I would need to get an STI checkup. Until she found out she had 5 different STIs once the symptoms became too obvious. So this is now bodily harm of your partner. This is emotional harm of the partner, bodily harm of the partner. And then for like the views of women who are cheated on this way on what the industry is vary. There are some who are brainwashed into this is like your husband getting a massage or therapy, so you need to accept this. If you, for instance, common scenario that men cheat is the wife has just given birth. So her body's not ready to have sex, and you need to months of healing is what I understand is a medical recommendation. And men who believe they have a right to sex might then go, okay, I guess I'll go outsource it to the professionals. And some women are told that this is the better deal. I mean, that also then gets into how these men are poor partners in other ways. Like what kind of man would even push his partner to have sex when she's just given, like that's already hugely inconsiderate and violating. So but I'm saying there's a spectrum of how the women experience that. Some are a bit relieved actually when the husband outsources it, which speaks to the ill health of that relationship. Others, I've been told, on top of all the harm, there's the feeling of, okay, you've now violated my values as well. My values of honesty, integrity, mutuality, and also the dignity of other people. So a lot of women said, like, if he had cheated with his colleague or his secretary or like whatever, that would have been horrible. But he used women who are extremely vulnerable, often migrants who don't speak the language well, often traumatized. These are not stereotypes. There's lots of research there. This is like finding out your husband goes out to like kick homeless men in the head as they're sleeping on the sidewalk. So it's that kind of experience. So I have no idea who I was partnered with. This is what he does when he says he's working out at the gym or meeting his friends. Gym is a good excuse because he can be like, he showers, so she can't smell it. Like the collateral damage there is huge, and we barely ever. All we talk about is, does the woman in the brothel or the escort agency or OnlyFans or campsite, is she all right with what she's doing? And if she said, yeah, I'm okay, which lots of survivors tell us they told everyone around them, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, because they couldn't see another way to make ends meet, or they were not ready to admit that boyfriend was actually a pimp. We just need their okay, and that's it. We don't discuss anything else. We don't look left or right like at anything else that's going on when there's so much harm happening there.
Yeah, and it seems like there's this push right now, especially in media, to say, well, don't, we make it again about judgment, or like as if it's a pro sexual health, sexual freedom thing to say, who are we to tell anybody what to do? And again, not taking into consideration like the long-term effects of this on the person buying, the person whose body is being commodified, and then their partner and all these different people and medical, psychological effects, all of those things. But it seems like there's a push to say it's for the good, like it's a beneficial thing for people's mental health. Like the sex worker can help this lonely guy who's depressed, and it's not her fault that his marriage is falling apart. That already happened. This is just a product of a relationship that's already on the rocks, which might be true. It seems like there's a lot of reasons, but it really just frames it in this way of like it's actually this charity and this like really good service, and it takes away all of the other parts of the conversation to consider that sex worker, but also the person that's buying and why they might be there, and making it look like they're just really lonely guys who need help, and this is a therapeutic process for them, and by purchasing a woman for sex, it's actually going to help their mental health and improve their condition, and it's going to help this whole thing get better.
I I really don't think it helps men's mental health at all. That's such a popular story. There's so much wrong with that statement. So, well, you could write an entire book about that statement. I mean, I'm sorry, like we call it colloquially blue balls, right? Like that men would be in pain if they can't get this. When you are depressed and lonely, you need real friendship. You need real family, and maybe you also need a real partner, or that would be a great addition. But sex and partnership and intimacy are just not a human right. So you might have a right to like shelter and housing and food, which right now for a lot of people is even in developed countries is becoming less and less available. So the women in the industry who you are paying, they're human. They're like most basic needs are not being met by our society. They've slipped through the supposed like protection structures of our society. What about their human rights? Like even if it did help his mental health, it's destroying hers. So even if it did help him, which I like, how is a 20-minute quickie a mental health check-in? How is that a therapy session? That's ridiculous. You have the whole added issue of the disability angle where they say, oh, this disabled man who can't get a date. There is this actually smaller than people think, smaller section of disabled men. Actually, men with disabilities on the whole do not have fewer partners, is my understanding. It's men with very, very, very disabling conditions. Where their communication or motor skills are like severely diminished, who really, really can't get a date. Actually, men who might be partially deaf or partially blind, actually, they are, my understanding is partnered statistically about as often as men who do not have these disabilities. But okay, let's talk about that tiny subsection. Again, sex is not a human right, even if your lives due to that condition is very limited. And you have a whole issue with nonverbal autistic men or men with dementia who might not always understand social appropriateness and might be found masturbating by care personnel or their families. The answer is not to call in a woman from the escort hotline. It's can you communicate to this man in the, in the state that he's in about limits or boundaries or like it's when I read reports about care personnel being sexually harassed and then hiring human fodder, a woman in prostitution as human fodder as a shield to protect themselves against this man because they don't know what to do with him. That's incredibly dehumanizing to that woman, whether that supposed solution works or not. But it also risks violating his consent, like a nonverbal autistic man or a man who is at a stage of dementia where he doesn't recognize people around him. How is he giving meaningful, authentic consent, understanding the situation and the repercussions or the context? So I think that those would be some of the situations where the buyer is especially harmed. You know, like I said, like an autistic man having like severely autistic or other kinds of disabilities, like having an erection is not consent to be touched. So this is anecdotally, but I have read and a report by a woman in German prostitution who was called in to a man like that, and he couldn't communicate at all. And she would remove the blanket and he would scream. So this is one anecdote where I would say this is a very unusual situation where the power dynamic is reversed, and I would consider her violating his consent and her perpetrating on him. But I'm just saying, when we say like lonely men who can't get a date, like this is where this leads. This is where it has led in practice. Or even more extreme, there are examples from multiple countries, including Canada, Switzerland, Germany, I believe Netherlands as well, where the men need sex so bad they will implode, they will fall into the deepest hole of depression has been extended even to convicted sex offenders in psychiatric clinics and prisons. And where they either get a discount at the local brothel or they get a woman to come there, or the therapists say, oh, before we send him back out, like we think we've re-socialized him decent enough, let him practice sex. Well, again, we're treating the woman as human fodder. Even if these things work, that's completely unacceptable to do to somebody. You're creating an underclass of people, mostly women, who are supposed to absorb all this negative energy. And as the survivors tell us, they are called survivors because a lot of them don't survive. Even if it worked, which I have no evidence that it does, I think it does the opposite. If you send a sex offender to a brothel, how's that going to improve his view of women with hardcore porn playing on screens in every room and the women barely being able to communicate? Like it's completely upside down land. And it's just, well, to say something a little bit hopeful, I do know some men who have quit porn. I also know some men who have stopped using the prostitution industry or who maybe went to a brothel once, had a look around, had a terrible feeling, didn't touch anybody and left, who now who have later managed to get into eye level, meaningful, connected relationships with women who can speak to, well, it is actually a loss. If you can no longer connect to half the human race, or even your connections with other men, if that's about how many women you slept with and what you did at the brothel last weekend, that's not a meaningful connection either. The men who have experienced real connection can speak to like what a loss it was to live without that. So I sometimes have men reaching out saying, I'm lonely, I'm considering this, or I've never had anybody, and I would recommend like 10 different things instead of that. Like I know it's not accessible to everyone, it's easier said than done, but like therapy, exercise, art, hobbies. Do you have one interest where you can go out and meet real people? Do you have a health issue that's been like affecting you for a long time that needs to be looked at? Spend the next year fixing that. And there's many good places that you could go, communities that you could join. You can join a men's group. I know that can be hard. If it's in person, if that's a lot, you can start it online. There's many places you could go to find yourself again and find other people again in a meaningful way. And the brothel is just so not the place to do that. Oh, I was going to mention one more thing, one last thing that last year I've been thinking about. We often talk about in our community and in the anti-trafficking community about the dissociation that the woman in the brothel experiences. So in order to tolerate the straight male strangers and their sexual whims, she disconnects and stops. You kind of exit your body as it's being used by somebody else, and so your pain is dulled, your disgust is dulled, all these things are dulled. So you can delay the trauma. It'll catch up with you, but it'll come later. And that's a huge issue. But I've actually read reports where the men say they are partially dissociative in what they're doing because they end up, just what I've read on the forums, paying to access women they don't even like or find attractive. Like, how disconnected are you from what, even sexually, not even speaking emotionally and intellectually or all the other ways you could connect with somebody, just sexually. They're like, oh, it's a warm body. She looked gross. Like, not that I feel a huge amount of pity for a man who talks like that about a woman, but he's so disconnected. He's like, sorry for this language. This is what they might say. I'm just like, I just want a hole tonight. Again, sorry for the language, but this is how they might talk at that stage. Where's the connection? Where's the positive mental health impact? He's not even in touch with his own basic sexual authentic desire. Like this is not even, he doesn't even come out and think, oh, this was a nice shag. Like, not even that. This is how disconnected these men can get when they're like, I just need like someone tonight, and it doesn't even matter who they are. And then afterwards, a lot of them feel crappy. They feel empty. A lot of them mix this prostitution use with substance use and alcohol. These are not happy, connected men. That doesn't mean that you couldn't have somebody in your friendship circle who seems totally integrated and fine and like they're getting along, who might also be doing this. But a lot of these men are not happy at all.
Wow. Yeah, I think, and I know that probably what you're sharing with us language-wise is probably like the tip of the iceberg, and there's probably, I mean, I know that it's shocking for people if you haven't maybe heard these kinds of things said or heard the kind of like common language in porn or these kind of forums, but that, I mean, it's really just scratching the very, very surface. But I think what is so upsetting and disturbing is that what we're kind of pushing and teaching men is that not only like you deserve sex, it's a right, but also growing up in a faith community, and my faith is still very important to me, but having been influenced by purity culture and now understanding like I don't think that aligns with my faith at all, or things that are very important to my value system, it because porn culture, or I mean purity culture, really said to men, you're just an uncontrollable animal and it's really on girls to stop your sexual advances. And it seems like porn culture is really just a different side of the same coin, and that's what we're telling people, like you're just this
Yeah.
uncontrollable animal. You just have to satiate these desires, and we're making women a pacifier to do that. You're just like pacifying these insatiable sexual things that are happening
Yeah.
to you, and they're just a product for you to get. Not even like, I mean, yes, we're painting it as this, you can be happy and fulfilled and your mental health will get better, but really, like as you're saying, most men are saying not even that, it just kind of gets me to tomorrow and then I'm back in the same place.
Yeah. And what you said about purity culture, so there isn't as much research about the buyers as there is about the women. That's still there's like a few dozen studies. There's not that much that actually goes in depth. Most of these studies just focus, they just ask them to use condoms because STI transmission is the one issue that everyone can universally agree is a problem. Um, but they don't tend to ask deeper. They don't ask, why do you do this? How do you do this? The ins and outs. But there's one study that's fairly recent, and I think that was Germany as well, that asked about men's access to sex education and their upbringing. And it turns out men of conservative backgrounds are more likely to use the industry, not less. And that also makes sense if you think about an extreme purity culture like a theocracy, like an Islamic theocracy. You can insert any religion there, though. I'm not singling that one out. It's just I've read some other studies. I think it was Lebanon that asked when men were first using the industry, and that for many men in that country, it was their first sexual experience. Why? Because age-appropriate exploration with somebody of the same age, where you have a little bit of a fumble and tumble as a teenager, and just start with like stroking and kissing and just figuring out your own body, like you know, is not allowed because that would destroy the honor of that girl. And so to maintain her honor, the so-called, I don't, this is again the purity culture concept that I don't personally recognize. I don't think you can I don't think people become destroyed or defiled honor-wise or value-wise by how many people have touched them or been inside their body. I think that's a very destructive way of thinking that traumatizes sexual violence survivors. So, um, but that culture inevitably produces prostitution, and on a mass scale, it also has this double standard of, yeah, but we kind of do want the men to be sexually experienced. So even though officially it's both men and women who need to not have any sex, or at least not, vaginal sex or penetrative sex until marriage, the men actually have this whole slightly covert masculine culture, like insert whatever adjective you want, where they do use prostitution and pornography. I think Pakistan is the world's leader in porn consumption, like a very, very religious country. And it makes sense because, oh, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. So sorry.
Right.
Uh, I'm just going to call them back. Um, and somebody did just ring the doorbell, and I think my roommate, I don't know if she heard that. So sorry. I'm
No,
just
you're
gonna quickly see if that's because that was my mom. I wanted to make sure everything's okay. Um, da, 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 da. Sorry.
you're fine. My dogs just turned to breakfast, so it was perfect timing.
Um, okay. Not an emergency. Okay, we just live close by, so sometimes like she comes by spontaneously. And
I get it. My mom was kind of close to me as well. I totally understand. If you need a minute before we start, feel free. If you need to get in the door or roommate or anything.
no problem. She just asked if I'm free in 3 hours, so we'll
Oh,
just
perfect.
I'll see her then. Um, so so that a purity culture makes the female body like hugely taboo. That both limits the woman in figuring out what her body does, and that is everything from menstruation to endometriosis to the details of pregnancy, which I thought if you actually valued mothers and babies, you would teach women what all these processes are because they're important for healthy pregnancies and children and moms and babies, but no, extreme purity cultures keep the knowledge from her, keep the knowledge from him as well. Afghanistan would be again the extreme example where now they have a ban on female doctors, ban on female education. Like that is the most extreme form. But there are, you know, variations of that exist in lots of places. And from what I hear, there are parallels to the experiences of some women in fundamentalist Christian communities all over the world, including the US, that I find really upsetting. So she doesn't understand her body. He doesn't understand her body. How is he supposed to understand mutuality and pleasure when no one's talked to him about it? So porn is the one supposed sex ed that's left, which is a very, very, very poor replacement. Also, he's more likely to respond stronger to nudity or anything sexual or like how men who live in cultures where women have to cover their faces, again, that would be most extreme, but like even a purity culture where like an ankle or a knee is an issue. Like I was recently hearing from a survivor of a very abusive fundamentalist Christian community talking about skirt measuring. How does that feel for a girl to have her skirt measured and to be told as a minor that you are sexually or potentially sexually enticing? Same way if you put a hijab on a child. So I'm against, putting barely 18-year-olds on OnlyFans. I'm also totally against veiling and skirt measuring. Like I think they both communicate the same thing to the girl. You are not a full three-dimensional complex human being who may want to partner with a man, maybe not, be allowed to like evolve and change her mind and figure out her own path. But no, you exist for him. You exist either for your future husband, you exist for your fans. You don't exist to figure out your authentic own path on all these things, how you want to look, how you want to live, how you want to love. And purity culture can be just as traumatic as the extreme porn culture that, like the extreme hookup culture that exists on some campuses, is just as bad as saying, you must absolutely wait until marriage. And if you don't, you are a broken, useless person. You are a whore. So that is the slur that like calling a woman a prostitute or a whore is the go-to slur for a purity culture. So, like you said, these are like they're completely like tied up together and they amplify each other, and they're none of these are healthy ways to live together. Even though the mostly men, some women who lead these communities will tell us this is the way, like extreme so-called sexual freedom, which ends up really diminishing vulnerable people's freedom, or extreme limitation. That's going to be the way that's going to keep you safe or liberate you. And I don't like especially like on our podcast, we talk about both sides of the coin. We have women from all over the world, South Korea, Egypt, US, Sweden, and we share our experiences and we find the connections between all of them because the ideas, how it expresses itself in the lives of women, girls, and men and boys can vary, and the level of how extreme it gets varies, but the fundamental ideas are the same ones pretty much every time when you dig down.
What would you say is the best way for us to approach this? I mean, you live in a country where prostitution is legalized. Prostitution is not yet legal in the US, but people are very pushing for it very much. And it's, we're having this kind of new way to figure out our culture where now it's not just like there's prostitution going on behind the scenes illegally. It's like this crossover with OnlyFans and influencers and social media and the media at large. And what kind of model or kind of solutions, multifaceted solutions, do you see to help a culture like ours that's on the brink of and really pushing for the legalization of commercial sex, and also for a society where you're at, where it is legal and you're seeing the effects of that in real time?
Yeah, policy solutions in this area is so tricky because it really requires all hands on deck. You need the judiciary and the police and the social workers and the local politicians and general society to work together. But it's the same on any big issue, any big societal issue like addiction or poverty or structural injustices or you know all the various crises. It that makes it complex, but it can also motivate people because it really does touch all our lives. If you are a person who interacts with people, this will impact you in some way or another, especially if you're a parent. But even I hear from like older women as well who's like like I said, like the divorces, the porn based divorces. I mean, um, and like I said, like men in care homes is a whole part of this issue as well. So it's like any stage of life. This is relevant in some way or another. So there are countries who've made tentative progress, but this is also all still very new. It's just a couple of decades. And we see in all these countries that unfortunately not all of society moves simultaneously. This is a multi-generational project of saying like, what kind of sexual culture do we want? We need some, if we want to live together peacefully, we need some shared values. When do we intervene and when do we let people do what they want? Where's the line? Is a tricky conversation, and I think that's going to be constantly renegotiated. But I would, generally speaking, look to countries like Sweden, Iceland. Other countries have adopted similar laws, though again, the level of implementation varies. Right now, a somewhat similar model exists in France, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada. Am I forgetting someone? Israel and Norway, and it's under discussion in a lot of countries. And to say something hopeful, also in Germany, we are starting to discuss this as a possible alternative to legalization. It's known as the Nordic model or the equality model, where we kind of do what Giselle Pellico said, the French survivor of like filmed serial group rape organized by her husband that I think most people have heard about. She said shame must change sides, and this is what the law tries to do, which means instead of arresting women or men who are selling in the industry, you remove criminalization as much as possible from them. For being in prostitution or, doing minor organizing of prostitution, um, and shift that criminalization and societal judgment over to the men who pay for it and the men, mostly men, some women who get rich, who are the traffickers, the pimps, the brothel owners, the escort agency owners, the owners of these horrible websites where everything's advertised. And you diminish the industry by shutting down the websites. They don't, yes, they'll move abroad, but if you are, a guy who's thinking about using the industry and these websites are illegal, that is a small barrier. And every barrier is better than none. And if you're thinking about hosting your bachelor party at the brothel, but then somebody says like, well, there are no legal brothels, we'd have to go to an illegal one. Yeah, you're less likely to do this. So it's about diminishing the market, that decreasing the demand. Of course, it doesn't disappear overnight. Of course, there's still an industry, an illegal one in these countries. But there's a huge illegal one in the legal countries because it's not like legal to sell and put this industry wherever you want. There are rules about it and they're broken all the time. So there's already an industry that's outside of governmental oversight. The governmental oversight that does exist is very limited here. And you say like, and you are actually, if you care about governmental oversight of the industry, this is a good law. Because right now, if I am, let's say, a detective, like a trafficking or a homicide detective, like whatever, and I want to know what's going on in that brothel, I would need a permit from a judge. So I would need a warrant. Under a Nordic model, it's much easier to gain access because this is not a legal business that has rights that can keep me out, that can keep social workers out, that can keep journalists out, that can keep scrutiny out. I have easier time investigating them. I have easier time getting a permission to wiretap them and looking at their phones and how they communicate. Oh, I just moved Anna over here, and then we're putting Svetlana here, and we're, those kind of conversations. You have a much easier. The police tell us in Germany that they can't while they're still on the job. We have a lot of retired detectives who are specialized in red light districts telling us we are so hampered right now because these are legitimate businessmen. Under the Nordic or equality model, they're not. They are criminals. It's illegal to profit from the prostitution of another person. You give the police a lot more tools, and you enable the prosecutors to punish these guys more, which again has a diminishing effect. So if I'm a human trafficker, which country would I go to? The one that says I'm a businessman until proven otherwise, or the one who says I am a criminal per se, even if that will still take time and police effort to find me and interrupt it? You are more likely to get government funding for these investigations. You're also more likely to get government funding to support the victims. And crucially, the last pillar of the model is engaging society at large in the conversation about this. What kind of sexual culture do we want? What are we going to teach our kids in school? Are we going to say there are this group of women, they can be your wives or girlfriends, and there are your whores? Sorry for the language, but that is, I mean, when I was in high school, whenever you graduate, we do a school carnival. Every year we had Hookers and Pimps Day, where you would dress up. So like I am talking about like completely regular schools making prostitution look like a party life, right? And like people having 18th birthdays and bachelor parties and going like having a school trip to Amsterdam or Hamburg has another infamous red light district. So do you want that kind of culture, or do you want to say like you just don't touch other people unless they're enthusiastically saying, please touch me? Is that so complicated? And you can't replace that with favors, with money, with gifts. And that, of course, will lead us to have to ask ourselves how many relationships and dating is also transactional, which is a fair question. People often say, like, how are you against prostitution? There's so many abusive marriages. Yes, exactly. Let's talk about both. But let's remove the most obvious transactional form of relationship first, because as long as that is normalized, men are not going to stop saying, oh, but I paid for the dinner, so why didn't she put out? How are we going to get that out of young men's heads while this practice continues? So I find these countries, they give me hope that there can be something else. But again, it still takes people on a local level going, I'm going to go to my city councillor and I'm going to go to my representative and I'm going to the local HIV support center, or like all the different actors who interact with the sexually exploited population, and get them on board and get them off the sex work train and get them off of that, narrative. It still requires that effort. So this is not a perfect policy, but neither is the shelter movement that was created in the, I think, 70s for domestic violence. We still don't have enough shelters now. So that's not a reason to decriminalize domestic violence. That like it takes time to build the support services and to change societal minds. And we're still such a work in progress on domestic violence right now. But I think that would be my tendency. And then once you have the policy, fight for the implementation, carefully observe the results, readjust. There will be new challenges. I mean, there's increasing war in Europe. I mean, now I'm not going to be sounding very optimistic, but in wartime, these kinds of issues like slide down the priority list. Like a lot of anti-violence services are immediately defunded, even though that's even more needed in wartime. So for me, like I'm taking the European perspective. From a European perspective, a lot depends on the future of like geopolitics here. And when it comes to the US, I've totally forgot. My understanding is Maine is the one state in the US that does have a Nordic model style law. I'm not sure if it has all of the pillars fully, but my understanding is that this is the closest that you do have. So my understanding is in the States, it's a state by state fight. And there is a movement for this, supported by a variety of groups. In New York, there's a push. So there's New Yorkers for the Equality Model. That's somebody to follow. And Cozy, like you mentioned, fights for this. Rights for Girls is like it says, Rights for Girls charity that works on this. Equality Now is another big charity. There are at least parts of the national organization for women or members who do support it. A lot of women's organizations are fighting about it. A lot of anti-trafficking organizations are fighting about it. If you're already part of a group that works with any vulnerable population, there is something you can do locally. Um, like I'm because unfortunately there is a number of people in social work who take this attitude of it's a lifestyle choice and I'm not going to intervene. And yes, you can't force people out of the industry just like you can't force them out of a domestically violent relationship. But the first step is that you understand this is not a safe place for them to be, and to create resources and tell them if you ever want to leave the lover boy pimp or like the weird boyfriend or the OnlyFans situation or whatever, here's where you could go, rather than saying, you go, girl, empowerment, this is like development aid and anti-poverty advocacy. So there's a lot that you can do on an individual level, I think.
That's fantastic. I have two quick questions before we go. The first is, what advice would you give people who are trying to figure out even just the language? Because the language we use is so important. And I think this would be beneficial for myself. I hear a lot of people say, which I think is a very valid point, and a lot of people I've talked with, that it doesn't make sense to use the term sex worker or sex work, because then we're kind of validating this industry as a whole. And when the majority of people in this industry are telling firsthand experiences of exploitation and abuse, or even as you said, maybe they're not even identifying yet, yes, I was a victim of trafficking or abuse, but I have the same experiences as someone who did. And on the other hand, I hear people saying, but if you want to reach people who identify as sex workers and see it as something empowering, then to use other language maybe kind of turns them off to the conversation. What advice do you have for kind of navigating that?
Well, I wouldn't like push a label on any individual that they are not ready to use for themselves. So that's one rule of thumb. As an organization, we have some episodes on our podcast to discuss language because it's hard, because we are still looking for that language. Even though this type of exploitation is thousands of years old, to find a language that's respectful, universally understood, and also people in the industry would be all right being referred to this way is so hard. So I can't give a general recommendation. I try to say a person in the sex industry or a person in prostitution. I know some people do find prostitution offensive. A person in a brothel or a person on OnlyFans, some way to separate the industry from the person linguistically. So, like sex worker or a prostitute, or these are all terms that kind of reduce them. And I prefer to say a person in a system, but the system is not the totality of who they are, or this is, the label doesn't attach as closely as one like prostitute or sex worker. And it feels more neutral because a person in the sex industry or the porn industry, there's still room for them to say, oh, this is exploitation for me, or this is, how I cope right now with my financial crisis. Or even right now, I feel good about this, which many people go through a stage where they do feel that way. Even people who later describe that they're traumatized, just like in domestic violence, where there's a love bombing phase, where if you're the new girl on the market, you will get a lot of attention, which will die down quite quickly, usually. But there might be an initial period of, okay, now I'm making a lot of money and I'm getting a lot of attention, even though it's not really meaningful, deep. You're not being seen as a unique person. If you are very starved for that, I can see how that would feel thrilling. I can sympathize with that. So yeah, when somebody is in that stage, they can be very sensitive to other people's language. So I might even, if I'm talking one to one, avoid using any kind of words. Sometimes carefully mirror theirs or be, like I said, like distant and descriptive without these labeling terms. But that's a tightrope walk. And for organizations, it's tough. I do have seen some organizations who have the same goals as the ones I am directly involved with, who do sometimes use sex worker. It might be maybe that in some outreach material. But then again, I've just recently been told by German social workers that the women in our brothels here don't use sex worker or prostitute. When you ask them, how do you make money? They don't have language for it because it's so shameful for them. They often come from very conservative backgrounds, like Orthodox Christian, where what they do is sinful and they are bad women and they are fallen women. So to even name it in any way that they try to avoid naming it. They're like, I don't know, I see men. Or they find some euphemism for it because they are not like, I am a sex worker and I am proud and I am a member of a union and I, I this is really good for me and my family. That's the exception. The average woman is feeling shame even when faced with a social worker who's just there to try to figure out what she needs and who's trying to come across as non-judgmental and eye level as possible. So um, that's the experience I hear. That could be a little different in the English language realm because from what I hear, I I do see a larger level of, but this is just the online world. I don't know what it's like on the streets, of how individuals self-describe. I certainly wouldn't use any slurs. Some people do use slurs for themselves. I would just like any other person, if they're slurring themselves, like you do not have to use a slur for another person. I don't know if that answered the question. It's a complicated question.
No, that's very helpful. The people first language aspect of it, and then because if you're saying this is a person, then they get to describe themselves however you want. You're just using technical terms, like just so we're on the same page of talking about a person who works in, the sex industry. That's super helpful. Okay, my last question. I'm going to try not to frame this in a complicated way, but I'm thinking of, so we talked a lot about purity culture and how destructive it is when you tell someone sex or someone using your body sexually is, like in an abusive situation, makes you less valuable or degraded. That's a very, very harmful thing to tell to someone, especially someone who's a survivor of sexual abuse or even domestic violence. And so for someone like me, like my faith is very important to me, but I don't see, even like I study theology, and I don't see that purity culture even aligns with theology as I understand it. But a lot of the people, in my life that are a part of my life or that my organization directly affects are very involved in religious communities, specifically evangelical Christianity. And so we have this big push, and it's been a really, I mean, really widely across the culture in the US. People have been speaking about the Me Too movement, and even we call it the Church Too movement, and purity culture and its destructive nature. But there's a lot of us who will still say, okay, we're never going to push these messages that your value is less or you're degraded or some of the really damaging parts of these messages. But we still have a faith system that says, like we believe in sin, or we believe this is the design for marriage, this is a goal for it, and sexuality. How would you give advice as someone, removed from not only just culture in the US, but maybe like, I think evangelicalism in the US specifically is a really unique thing. And as someone who maybe doesn't identify as being very religious, what advice would you give for someone in my position to navigate that well so that we, there's still values and things that are going to be important to you and your belief system that you're going to hold on to tightly. And we want to stay away from this. We want to stay away from corn culture. We also want to stay away from purity culture. From the outside looking in, what kind of advice would you give us?
Sorry, just so I understand correctly, to say, okay, I understand you reject porn culture, but purity culture is also a problem, or what's the goal of the communication?
Yeah, sorry, that was a very confusing way that I asked that question. So if just how we teach young women and young girls about sexuality and their bodies, and young men as well, as we approach this topic, and we want to make sure that we're creating a flourishing society where we're not pushing people into purity culture or porn culture, where we're not promoting that sexuality degrades your body, or also that you're allowed to just use women, and women, your job is just reject men's advances and, this objectification culture. But also, we have these religious and faith values about, sin and marriage and these things that are still going to be important. So like from the outside looking in, what kind of advice would you give navigating both of those things at the same time?
When talking to young people.
Yeah, young people, especially high school students.
So I'm not an expert on sex ed. I do know some people who do it, and there have been programs developed, for instance, by Culture Reframed, which is Gail Dines' organization. So this is still being developed. Like I'm understanding is they've been developing projects for different ages, how to talk about porn without shaming the kid going, oh, you're interested in breasts? You awful. No, you're just a boy in puberty. This is normal. This is not unhealthy. What's unhealthy is if you try to like push a girl in your class to send you nude photos, or you're slipping into extreme pornography, and you think this is fine and you need to replicate this. So there are programs like that, but they are still relatively new. And of course, they need to like constantly get adjusted because now there's Snapchat and TikTok, and I don't know what the next hellscape is going to be there. To balance the we understand your curiosity, and sex is not a terrible thing, but it depends on the parameters. It depends on the situation. Sex can be a wonderful thing. It, unfortunately, can also be a terrible thing. And I would, especially the boys, but like the girls, like both do need to hear this. Like it's important how you treat other people. It, it's like yeah, there are these programs. My understanding is they do often separate the boys and girls for some of these conversations because they are not completely like sex neutral. And it's for the girls, it's this is a like I would say you're going to be hard pressed to find any woman who has not been socialized to be towards people pleasing. I think the majority of women are, and that when that then gets into a sexual situation, that's really tough. I hear from women all over the world who were taught like as long as he gets his satisfaction, that's it, that's all that's needed. So girls actually need to hear no, take time to explore your own body. We're going to give you information you need to understand your period, to understand fertility, to understand, I'm also personally, this is my opinion, skeptical about pushing, what's the term? Hormonal birth control as a universal fix-all, because I do hear from so many women who have negative side effects. That doesn't mean wait till marriage is the alternative. Like again, let's like a lot of these solutions are work in progress. So you need to teach the boys about taking responsibility with protection, but not just protection is just the basis. What you need first is to keep looking for mutuality. Okay, maybe you really want this girl, but she's not interested. I I don't think it's the equivalent of religious shame to shame a boy who touches a girl or pushes her to send pictures or whatever it is. I do think that's behavior that societally should be shamed. There should be consequences. Like when there's boys acting up at school, I think the people in authority need to take that very seriously. There do have to be consequences. And I know then there the tightrope is to not communicate to all the boys, you all have a potential predator hiding inside you. And then and it's hard because there's so much toxic messaging all around that's going to be curated in a more exciting way. Like Andrew Tate is more exciting to watch. I'm sure there's fundamentalist influences with very high quality production values or more exciting to watch than, like we make podcasts and it's like self-produced. We often pour our own money into these projects. We don't have funding. We're trying to provide like the third way message, and it's hard for us to get the word out. We're competing a lot. But if a lot of the institutions and the parents, everyone was pulling on the same strings, talking about mutuality, also talking about how most boys also want meaningful connection and gentleness and creativity and exploration. And I've heard now from a lot of young men who are like, she thought I wanted to strangle her or, I'm sorry, ejaculate on her face, but I never wanted any of that. And sometimes like there are couples who do that because they think they have to, but neither of them wants it. So it's just not a universal truth that boys are born and they're pornosexual. I think that's learned. I think there's a very small subgroup who might have, sociopathic tendencies where that does speak, but I think that's the exception. I think the average boy wants meaningful connection, wants a healthy form of sex where there is not a high risk of injury and all these negative side effects. And to let boys know if they ever had an icky feeling in any of their involvement with porn or sexual culture, they have a right to that icky feeling too. And they're like I said, they don't all have a monster waiting to wake up. But if we do see you overstepping a boundary, we are going to take that very seriously. So that's a balancing act. And I think if you speak to young people, I don't know, there have been consent programs for years, and my understanding is not all of them are effective. So I'm not I'm not a sex ed expert who can tell you the exact mechanism. I can recommend culture reframed, and then maybe they can recommend the, the what you would package with that on general sex ed, because porn cannot be discussed in isolation, consent cannot be discussed in isolation. And my understanding is some of the sex ed now in Germany, just from acquaintances of mine who are working in that area, they are then, if you're like a school nurse or a teacher or a parent, you can get an additional education in that realm because your teen is gonna want to talk to you. Or maybe you're like us, you're a young adult and you've grown up in this culture and you're still processing your own experiences these past few years and you're not crazy and you're not alone. And there is there's a movement growing. I think Fight the New Drug is one of the another US based organization. They're not policy based. They're just, if you ever felt something was off about porn, you're not crazy. Here's why. We would kind of need the same thing for prostitution because that's not there yet. But these, like we said, they link so much that there's no reason we can't apply some of the wisdom learned in what these groups have been trying to do and apply that to prostitution. And but I think, yeah, you also need to get governments involved to want to fund that and to not consider that frivolous or to consider that sexualizing young people. So we do need to have a consensus that sexuality is natural and can be connective and meaningful and beautiful and can lead to children, but that's not the only purpose. And all of this, it's still being built. So, like I said, I'm not fully trained, and it's still a work in progress. And we have to see what the lessons are from these groups on how to reach people. There are some celebrities that have spoken out about this as well. So, what's his name? From Brooklyn, the show with the cops. What's his name? Oh my God, I'm blanking. Terry Crews.
Oh, yes,
Terry
yes.
Crews. Yeah, so he's an advocate against pornography. He's also talked about how he has a seemingly like hyper masculine, just from his physical build, hyper masculine man. He has been sexually harassed. So he's spoken up publicly that you can, that this is important for boys. Like the rate of boys who are predated on by adults is significant. So boys can be victims too. And when it comes to sex trafficking, there are adult men, but it's more likely to happen when you're a minor. So that's the whole issue that we need to do prevention on. So that's a whole big ambitious project. And how would you reach more conservative or fundamentalist thinking people? I wish I knew. I always try to go like, but if you actually want happy, healthy, connected families, I guess we kind of have to demonstrate the harms of purity culture and how purity culture leads into porn culture. Like I said, like highest rate of consumption. I'm understanding porn consumption is higher in the Bible Belt. So what you're doing right now is not working. And if you genuinely care about the health of young people and women and families, and like we see, the young people not having sex, not dating, fewer marriages, fewer babies. So if you actually want a future for lots of happy babies, you have to be against porn, but you have to understand purity culture pushes people towards it. So your plan is upside down. So I don't know, evidence, but are people always convinced by evidence? Maybe I think survivor testimony is a big deal. And like I think what you're doing, like being somebody who is still off faith, but saying we do have problems, let's not sweep them under the rug. I think you're already doing part of the work. So
Thank
I
you
wish
so
you
much.
much success with it.
Yeah, and that was a fantastic answer, by the way. And to see that, also show people data that these forms of purity culture where we're doing these pushing these kinds of messages that honestly, again, from my perspective, I'm like, I really care about what, I'm an evangelical Christian, so I really care about what the Bible says. I don't think this is at all representing what it tells us. So I think that's a really fantastic answer and really compelling to think
I was
about.
going to add,
Oh, go
so
ahead.
sorry to interrupt. I was going to add one thing. I have not done intense Bible study, and I'm personally not religious at all, but there is a extensive, slightly erotic love poem in the Bible that is not even, maybe you know which one I mean. There's not even a mention of any like miracles or anything else that you might usually find it's a love. I think it's a love declaration and about someone's passion for their partner, and with lots of metaphors for fruit and the land. It's a while ago, but I read it and it was like, it was definitely erotic in nature. There were at least erotic undertones. So that's in there. So for thousands of years, people have written about the beauty of sexual love and the healthy version of sexual love and passion. So if you need some Bible passages, it is there. I think most people don't know it's in there. I don't know if you know which one I'm referring to. I forgot. It has a name. I forgot what it's called.
Yeah, I think Song of Solomon's probably. It's like a yeah, and it's yeah. There's all of these parallels and like this Hebrew, imagery of yeah. It's actually a really fascinating. If you're looking at it from a Hebrew Bible perspective, it's really fascinating. But also, the Bible is not shy on sex at all. And it's like understanding the framework for which we're supposed to view it and all these things. But it's, ancient Jewish people were not afraid to talk about sex very often. So hopefully that is a good way for us to introduce people to that we need to have these conversations and they need to be a part of this, because when we ignore it and say, la la la, you don't need to worry about it, then people are just going to be really influenced by pornography. Or when we push purity culture, then we're pushing them towards pornography, and it's just creating this whole cycle we never intended to start.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I've so enjoyed our conversation, and you have so many wonderful insights. You talked about your podcast. Let us know where else people can find you.
So I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I don't put Facebook is dying, so I don't put much content on there. Little bit TikTok, but that's a lot of work. So mostly YouTube and Twitter. And then on the podcast, so on those sites, I'm Elly with a Y, Arrow, like arrow and bow. That's my handle everywhere. And then our podcast is called Red Light Expose. And that's the handle on most sites except Instagram, where it's rle.podcast. And if you just Google Red Light Expose, you'll find our website and everything's on there. So our podcast is available on all the regular sites. And like I said, it's a team of survivors and then me and another woman who talk about the ripple effects on our lives. And we go through all the different angles on this issue. And purity culture is something we've discussed in the Islamic sense, but we have multiple episodes we want to do to discuss Christian cultural contexts and to speak to people. That's not to say that I will definitely also say I've met multiple social workers and survivors who found their own version of faith healing and life-saving. And I would not discount that. And I get very annoyed when the pro-prostitution movement or people say that, the religion needs to be like completely kept out. I wouldn't recommend a value judgment through a religious lens, just personally speaking, to like have all of society look that way. But like I said, a lot of the women in the brothels are quite religious, and that is meaningful to them. And if you want to connect to them, gain their trust, communicate, talk about finding pathways out of there, actually having faith-based social workers do that communication is helpful and meaningful. So that's just what I've been told. It's like reframed as just Bible pushing, which also exists. So you have the other extreme where there's I'm now answering a question that wasn't even asked. You also have people. You do have people who try to recruit vulnerable people from homelessness or addiction or sexual exploitation into their faith community, which I think is predatory. So you do have to give unconditional support. Like you cannot ask the vulnerable person to like match your worldview. But if you connect through faith, then if that's being done in a healthy way, that's not shaming, but that's life affirming and dignity affirming, then like all the power to those people. And we do have, I think at least one member of our team also, that's her experience that faith is helpful and healing. And I know for sure she's not the only one. So we try to have a multiplicity of viewpoints, but what we all agree is this is exploitation. This does not belong in a healthy society. This needs to end by reversing the stigma from the person in the industry to the people who make money and who get short-term pleasure, but not, like we said, not meaningful connection or happiness out of it. So that's our mission at Red Light Expose.
And I think it's going to help people. It does help when people see there's people on totally different continents with totally different belief systems who both say there's something very wrong with the system that's happening here. And we can all recognize that. It helps people say, I need to pay attention to this. So thank you so much for your work and everything that you do and for having a chat with me today.
Thank you for having me and for fighting back against purity culture. There's not enough of that happening. That needs to be a big movement.
Back. What did you guys take away from this talk with Elly Arrow?
Well, I'll jump in and let Ivan think some. One of the things I really sort of noticed was two general ideas. One, an examination of how we perceive other people and how we view other people as individuals or objects, which again I've harped on several episodes. It's as if that's an underlying theme for a lot of this discussion. But also how we understand ourselves and what we feel like we want or we need and what we're willing to do to satisfy those needs. And one of the things that really the conversation started off with that I stuck to was this idea of dehumanizing a person for the purposes of creating a person that doesn't exist. That was a line that was used early on in the discussion. So I become so centered, and there were several instances of just sort of this self-centered, self-gratification, self-satisfying action, whether we're talking about fetishism that relates to the practice of violating consent, to what we want in a sexual partner, to seeing an individual as a literal sex machine, and we're not talking about that in a sexy way, but in a dirty way, being easily replaceable, not feeling feelings of disgust when we see individuals dehumanized. And so you have the victims that are treated in such a way, and then you have the individual who is doing the acting, doing the envisioning of those things. And I think the talk helped me sort of approach both of those groups. So how to approach victims, how to approach some of the things, the way the victims are treated, and then to ask some foundational questions as to why do individuals behave in such a way where they are devaluing or dehumanizing an individual. And so those sort of two discussions were the things that I primarily noticed over the course of the discussion.
One of the big things looking at it from just my perspective, something that she said, that the skirt measuring and the hijab wearing are pretty much one in the sense of protection of purity, using that idea of purity culture as the same as also looking at it from the standpoint of the sex work. Like we see these things from the standpoint of grace is like the grace needs to be for the religious and also for those that are in the sex industry. And using that term, I really like how she said when you asked the question about the language of sex work, what would you use? What would you use? And she went into saying like it should be we should use the term a person in the sex work industry rather than labeling them. And it's pretty funny. You called us nerds at the beginning of the episode. I was like, hey, am I a nerd? I think I self-label myself as a nerd, but are you allowed to call me that? I don't know. What do you? And I'm sorry for making that light of it, but that idea of something that we do every day, and I'm not trying to make fun of you, but this idea of seeing them as person rather than who they are. Like, I'm a person that plays a card game, that likes Star Wars. This is a person that we need to see not from the length of their skirt or the amount of things they have done, but to see people through that love and that grace. I think it's really cool to see how she said that like, don't call names. You're more than what you do or what has been done to you. And I think that's really huge that we would show that respect. And also, what I thought what was interesting was the conversation of what is legal and allowed is not always beneficial. And that's something that big discussion also, another podcast as it were. But this idea of how it was looked at as a good thing, but we see the dark side of walking through and the end of those systems. We see that abuse and people not being seen in the image of God, not seeing as that imago Dei, and I think that both in the sex work and then also in the purity culture, we see that it's the same thing. It is the objectifying of women, and I keep going back to, for me personally, some of the ministry things that I experienced and some of the times that I spent like in that culture, that we made that an idol for us. And I think we've talked about it before. We've made that an idol for people to follow. And with that, it doesn't look at the people, just looks at the act. Like we've gone back into this works idea that what they do or what we do is what defines us and what defiles us. But we know that God's love is bigger than that. And so I think those are some of the jumbled thoughts and things that resonated in my mind from this time, this interview.
I think one of the things I would pick up from Ivan's comments was that this distinction again between legality and ethical or moral claims, right? Mm-hmm. And so we talk about this a lot in my profession, where a lot of the classes that are in a university setting are often ethics, so medical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, whatever. More often than not, those classes don't necessarily teach ethical theory, but more are dealing with litigation and cases. So how do you, as a nurse, handle a patient who is a Christian Scientist who doesn't want to use blood donation or give blood as part of their religious practices? For many ethicists, myself included, we can distinguish between these sort of legal questions and thinking about fundamental human questions that are associated with it. So here, again, we may talk about the legality of certain practices and being near a state where you have larger issues of prostitution just a little bit to the west of us. Mm-hmm. Just because something is legal doesn't necessarily make it morally right. And again, the fascinating thing is we see little sprinkles and cracks of that forming. If you pay attention, you've been likely hearing a large discussion about the legality of sports betting that's going on right now, to the point where there are several figures that are being caught with issues with sports betting. So just because something is legal doesn't necessarily make it morally right. And in that process of questioning its morality, the underlying issue of what are you doing to other people? Why are you doing this to other people? And one of the things that I found rather interesting from Arrow's discussion was the claim that men of conservative backgrounds are more likely to use prostitution. Mm-hmm. This idea of objectification, devaluing, dehumanizing, right? And again, I'd have to look at the data to see whether the data supports those sorts of claims. But how are we viewing other people? How are we viewing other people's purposes? Are we seeing them as image bearers, or are we seeing them as images of our own gratification?
Something I thought was really interesting and disturbing was she talked a lot about like people aren't owed sex, but in her culture, this is something that's becoming more popular, where men in nursing homes or prisons or people with certain disabilities are being provided sex workers, and the sex worker is seen as like an outlet for that person. So again, this idea of dehumanizing, like you have this thing that you need, and you need it so much that it comes at the cost of dehumanizing someone else. And then she even talked about like, what are the ethics around this? If someone can't verbally communicate, then how do, this, another question about consent and all of this. But I think that's really an important topic to bring up, especially in the purity culture conversation, because it really framed sex as this thing for especially men. Like, you have to have this thing. You just can't help it. It's just a part of who you are. And so basically just like hold it all in until you get married, and then your wife is an outlet for you to use to kind of like quell these desires, which is not at all a biblical picture of, like God's design for the ordination of marriage and the design for sex within that. But also it just really treats people like an end or means to an end. And
A la Kant.
a la Kant, as always. And it really, it just brings up a lot of really interesting questions in that space.
Yeah, I think with this idea of this act is going to fulfill your need in the proper space, we do see, and with a lot of our background, evangelical background, believe within the bonds of marriage, what that looks like. And but it's been made such an idol, as we talked about, that once you get it, that is like, okay, now whatever I do, this is my right, rather than that partnership as a helper even to one another. That the equality is not that now I have you and now everything is good, but we would look at one another in that same heart of looking at people with that worth and that value, that even and I could see that even in my life, and sometimes the way I treated my wife, and sometimes I do, like, I did this, you owe me. And that's something that I've had to deal with, something that I know, having to reset my mind of what it means to be in relationship with people. And I think that's a part of that cultural change, that there's so much wrapped up in the pursuit of happiness, that, again, and we've talked about it before, that we're like, whatever I want is more important than what all the other people, and that causes, this idea and this desire is going to hurt other people. And in this culture, and we're looking at Utah. I did very cursory research. There was some research that said Utah is the #1 use of pornography back in 2009, but that was just from one study. So you could go back. Saw another report that we're third in the nation for consumption of pornography, and just our neighbor in Nevada, there is legal prostitution and brothels in certain areas. And so you see this this desire funneling and being powered by money and greed and the desire for happiness that just churns people up and spits them out. And that's the cultural change that I feel, that we can enter into the legislation, and looking into some of the things even done in Utah now, that you need to have age verification now for people that consume, some ways to protect the children. And then she brought up Gail Dines and some of the opportunities that are provided with some of their programs, which is really cool.
I think, again, the lingering thing that fits for me is, what are you seeing in the relationships that you have? That whether we're talking about how we perceive sex and intimacy, and at one point she very blatantly says sex and intimacy are not a human right. I find that claim to be rather interesting. The idea, and at one point she said, how can you be inside the body of another person and not be sure if they want to be there? That was a gut punch in a lot of ways, because we when we are talking about what intimacy, even the word intimacy, if we're not talking about sex, it's being close, it's being connected to somebody. And if you're seeing that connection as just a means of gratification for yourself, how are you viewing the individual who you're engaging? Yep. And if this is somebody who you're connected to through a long-term relationship, this is an individual who you've dedicated your life, you've made vows, you've promise to be with that person, to share all things. And here, at least in the relationship that I have with my spouse, this is the person who I trust most in the world, who I can be most open with in the world, who I can remove my mask with, so to speak, and be most vulnerable with. And if I perceive that individual as an object, why am I as a person doing that? And so, there's a line that she also mentioned. She says, when you're hurting or in need of real friendships, real connections, a real partner, maybe we do these things because we feel like we need something. And there's another interview that we'll hear next week that talks about soothing and how we often try to soothe ourselves, to paraphrase Mike Doty, to soothe the searing sadness and the nameless gnawing. There's this element to try to soothe ourselves. In that process of soothing ourselves, we end up harming other people. But that too is self-centered. That, if you're a follower of Jesus, you have this whole, discussion in Timothy about how women should behave to men, but also men behave like Christ Jesus. There's not a lot of using people in the behavior of Christ. There's a lot of washing of feet. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of sacrifice. And if I am called to act like Jesus to the people that I'm most connected with, and it involves me being selfish, then I really need to rethink the way that I am viewing either the partnerships that I have or who I understand Jesus to be.
And if we think that we're owed certain things, or like that's just how I was made, like I'm just oriented to sin, and it's just, which I understand we have this sin nature, but just like it is so hard for me to fight this urge because it's just a part of who I am, and I'm kind of doomed to fail in this way over and over. Then it makes it really easy to justify actions, to say I have to because I have this need and I just have to. And I think that ends up being something that comes up in a lot of these conversations, especially in the purity culture conversations towards women. Like, your husband just has a super high sex drive. Oh gosh, I just hit my microphone. Your husband has a super high sex drive, so you pretty much have to meet that need. If you don't meet his needs, then he just has to go to some kind of outlet, and it might be an affair or it might be porn. And so it's like you have to be this kind of machine to make sure that he doesn't ever fail in this relationship or sin in this way. And I think if we framed other things that way, we would understand that's nonsense. It's kind of like someone saying, I'm prone to anger because I'm Irish, I
wouldn't necessarily call it nonsense. I call it addiction.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like the language that you're describing. I have to have this, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to move to my partner and insist on it. I'm going to emotionally manipulate individuals. If I cannot get what I need in this relationship, I will go to whatever means that I can, legal or otherwise. Yep. Doesn't that sound like the behavior of an addict? And when we talk about substance abuse, the kind of, I need this fix, I need to do this thing, it doesn't matter who I hurt, it doesn't matter what I do, because I have needs. And so, I think that in the discussion of the relationships that we have, what are we addicted to? What do we idolize? And if I can be fully transparent here, one of the most humbling moments I had as a son, and they won't listen to this podcast, so it doesn't matter. But I remember a conversation that I had soon after I was married with my mother, and she said at one point, early in their marriage between my mother and my father, she said, she asked my father, do you want me to respect you, or do you want me to love you? And my father said, well, I think respect is the thing that you should prioritize. And that has stuck with me in terms of something not to emulate within a family, because love is not about necessarily respect. It's about self-sacrifice and giving. And so, I think that evaluate, what do you see your partner as? What do you see yourself as? And if you're using the language of, I have to have this, I need it, or I hurt, or I need these things, get therapy. Go to a therapist. It is the language of addiction. It is not the language of a functioning human. Get therapy.
And beyond the fact that we've taken that language and then kind of baptized it as Christian, like that's what the Bible says. It's also, that's the part that I think is nonsensical of like how can we take this relationship between a husband and wife where he says, husbands die like Jesus did, like be the first to put yourself down. If you're going to lead, it's not that you're above reproach or that you're first in line. It's that you're the first to lay yourself down. So how can we turn that into a relationship where you use another person for your gratification or put your needs before them? And something else I've found interesting throughout all these interviews is, as you've mentioned a few times, John, like it's almost necessary to treat another person like they're not real or they're not actually a person in order to pursue, purchasing someone for sex or pornography. And as I remember in Helen Taylor's interview, she was talking about how most of the men that they've interviewed, because through Exodus Cry, sometimes they'll kind of do I don't know if sting operation is the right term, but they'll talk to someone who wants to buy sex and make them think they're going to have a meetup, and then they end up talking to them and say like, hey, here, they have a conversation, then a heart-to-heart and a one-on-one with them. And she said often a lot of the people that they've talked to in those situations are former sex buyers or people who watch pornography compulsively tend to just say, I can't think of this person like a person. I have to disassociate it. It doesn't matter if you told me their backstory or that they were abused or the reasons that they got here or that even that this is not consensual, because in order for me to get to this place, I have to remove myself so much from the humanity aspect of it, or else this doesn't meet the needs that I have or that I want to be met.
So again, the language here is the language of human fragmentation. So whether we're talking about addiction, one of the other things that I work with is returning military veterans, particularly veterans who've dealt with active duty. And there's this idea called moral injury. It's a spectrum disorder as opposed to something like PTSD, which is a triggering event disorder. Anyway, the long issue there is this sort of disassociation, this fragmentation of the individual who, we are taught to treat people as we want to be treated, like variations of the golden rule and all of that jazz. And here you are taking another person. And so in military practices, I value human life. I shouldn't try to kill another person. In military training, you're taught how to kill other people. So in this case, you're told respect other people. Certain instructions about consent. And then you get to a point where you say, I have to disassociate from that moral connection. I fragment myself so that I can gratify what I need to gratify. And so it is the language of addiction. It is the language of moral injury that you are describing in discussing individuals who are trying to justify their actions.
Looking at organization and this idea, I kept thinking of the industry, this idea of it's like an MLM, like who can satisfy me, and then you send that money back up to me, and then they find, and then it's just this domino effect. But in reality, what it needs to be, kind of what you were talking about, is that it needs to be a flipped upside down triangle, that we see who can I lift up, and there's a reset there. When we view other people, like how can I lift them up rather than how they can be used by me. And I love that visual of a triangle that, you're at the bottom, you're going to lift up other people. And we see that, as you said, through Jesus' life, that he humbled himself and to lift us up, to bring us, and just the beauty of that, what that looks like. And, for a lot of, a lot of church ministry and being a part of even some marriage seminars and listening to different people speak in some of those circles, it really, there's a lot of things that were good, but some of the things that have come out of some of those things is that subservience of women, that, and it was always you need to make sure you take care of your husband, cook, clean, sex, take care of them, kids. It was always, and even in those circles, it felt like a commodity. you are providing a service for this man. And I was like, I don't like that.
Well, it's one of the things you've mentioned in a couple of your interviews, are like some of the cultures associated with like Tate and that sort of thing. This sort of effort to disconnect or devalue individuals. Like we see this throughout history, right? So whether we're talking about an individual based on their ethnicity or their gender or their religious practices, that if we can convince a group of people that they are less than, then there's less rights, mercy, grace, whatever you want to put into that. So if I convince a culture that women are objects, or that real men treat women in these sort of ways, and ignore, again, I point to the figure of Jesus. What did the figure of Jesus do? How did the figure of Jesus act? And who did Jesus engage? And in that sense, this sort of, you can begin to recognize the points of this devaluing, dehumanizing. And that's not to say that there aren't partnerships that exist with different skill sets and different abilities. That's not what we're saying here. But it's when you say that a person exists for my gratification, or a person exists, if I have a need, this other person must meet it because of who they are, then there's serious concerns to who you're objectifying and why you have those needs the way that you do.
And I think, too, I've seen this happen where people assume that people who are staunchly complementarian in terms of marriage and female leadership within the church and are inherently going to think of marriage that way, that a woman is an object, and then egalitarians, people who support egalitarianism within those contexts would be like, whenever a woman is in charge, then this is great. And I've seen this happen where I know some complementarians who would never, ever waver on their ideas about women in ministry, who demonstrate the love of Jesus in their marriage, who might be so traditional in every way, but in an egalitarian context, because they think of leadership as a hierarchy of being a leader means I have more rights, I have more honor, I have more privilege to do whatever I want, then that relationship, or whatever that situation is, whether it's like a church leadership or within a marriage, it can become the exact same thing, because it's viewing this leadership position as something where I just get more of what I want. And thinking of what you were talking about, John, I think it's really dangerous when we start to think of, oh, you guys, I totally lost my thought. We have to cut this out. You know when that happens when I had such a great idea. It's totally gone from my brain.
But I think one of the egalitarian, complementarian discussion, I think that there's something important there, that as we were saying, that you can have a complementarian point of view and not fall into this sort of hierarchy position. People have different gifts, they have different talents. There's sort of the connections there. And objectification can happen regardless of what your view of marriage is.
Yes.
The issue is, how are you treating other people? And if you hold the life of Jesus, if you hold Jesus to be who he is, who he says he is, then part of the relationships that we have involve sacrifice, involve giving up and humbling ourselves. And again, Paul is pretty clear about this. The Gospels are pretty clear about this. And, I think that there's the lingering issue of, like, what idols, and again, this is something I've been tossing around a little bit, what idols are we creating? And maybe my own gratification is an idol. Now, there's lots of nuance to this, having to this conversation. When in discussing sex, things like issues of pain and issues of intercourse, all of those things are tied to a discussion and relationship that you have with people. And so it does become it's a complicated issue, and I realize that in a 30-minute conversation, we can't cover all the bases. But are you seeing your significant other, your spouse, your wife, your husband, as someone who you are sacrificing and living for? Or do you see them as something that you can be gratified by? And whether that gratification occurs sexually, whether it occurs through financial gain, whether it occurs through confidence, whatever, then you have an idol. Again, I go back to the language of addiction. So much of this discussion frightens me almost because of how similar it is to conversations that I've had with addicts, to conversations that I've had with returning veterans about this sort of fixation and focus that they have. And so, if you're willing to violate consent because you get off on it, you have a problem.
And in the language of addiction, is what I was thinking. If we think of sin as something where like it's just like a release of something and I get what I want and then I'm okay, then we're misunderstanding that the reason that Jesus makes us free is because we're set free from our sin. To be addicted to something and then for a minute have something that makes me feel good and fulfills what I need for a second, and then I need it again and I need it again. That's not freedom in any way. That's real slavery to something, whether it's in your mind or body or both. And when that involves another person and using them, that's a whole nother level. But that's not freedom, because it's just like I get whatever I want whenever I want. That is more in line with addiction language. And that's why I think the vision that Jesus gives us for sexuality is the only one. And by vision, I mean like the design that we believe the Bible has for marriage and for sexuality within that is the only one that can show the dignity and value to both people, because they're not being treated like a means to an end or like an object, and not, partaking in whatever the culture says is acceptable when it comes to sexuality is not this repression and you're holding all of this inside and you're not able to express yourself freely. It's actually stepping more into the freedom that Jesus has for us.
I think that's huge with looking at it from that view, and something that I encourage those that are getting married or desire to get married is that your marriage, that you, and I could use the idea of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like before you get married, you need to be in that self-actualized state, or else you're going to just suck it dry. And obviously there's a lot of nuance there. I'm just kind of hyperbole, but really like you need to, from the standpoint of Christian background, that we need to find our complete, that we are whole in Jesus before we can enter in many of these relationships. And that's the cool thing, that we can give to one another. And I think that's where we go from taking to giving, and being giving in all the relationships that we are in. And so I'm just grateful for that. Yeah, that reminder for us. And what I do love about it is this idea that you even mentioned it. Do we agree fully with everything, all the different interviews? No, but we find those connection points, and I think that's encouragement for us, for people that listen, is find those connection points where we could grow and growing together. I think it's huge.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, another week, another great interview, and we'll be back next week.